What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. We're going to continue celebrating Black History Month with the greatest African-American fighters in boxing history. And I decided to take a look at 1938. Because in my estimation, 1938 was one of the greatest years for the black fighter. How so? Well, if you take a look at Henry Armstrong, 1937, he became the featherweight champion of the world by defeating Petey Cerrone in New York's Madison Square Garden, knocked him out in 6 rounds. Now, how significant was that? Well, not only was he in the middle of a 27-fight run in 1937, but he would be undefeated with 26 knockouts. The only fighter he didn't knock out was Aldi Spaulding. And it turns out he knocked out Aldi Spaulding in 1942 and 1944. He didn't knock him out in 1937. Aldi Spaulding was very rugged and tough. But when you take a look at his career, as we will, within 9 months, he would win 3 world championship titles and 3 different weight divisions. But the other point is Henry Armstrong was the only black fighter to win a featherweight championship belt in the United States. Now, George Dixon would do it in Canada. Kid Chocolate would come from Cuba. But Henry Armstrong was from the United States of America, Columbus, Mississippi. And he did it in Madison Square Garden. You only had a few fighters to do that. John Henry Lewis, Joe Louis, Tiger Flowers, young Peter Jackson. But young Peter Jackson would win the colored welterweight championship belt, which I include as a championship belt. Henry Armstrong would be the first featherweight in boxing history. Now, if that was not enough, he would move up in 1938, the year that we're celebrating, to challenge Barney Ross, a man from New York that would move to Chicago. One of the greatest fighters in boxing history. He was in a 3-fight war with Jimmy McLaurin. And an outstanding fight with Tony Canzoneri, Lou Ambers, and others. He would carry Barney Ross for 15 rounds. He respected him that much, and they both had the same manager, Eddie Meade. He would now hold 2 world championship belts and 2 different weight divisions. And he would move up from featherweight directly to welterweight. And then he would go back down to lightweight and defeat Lou Ambers for the lightweight championship belt. And he would hold all 3 belts simultaneously. He did it in 1938. He only had 8 divisions. Now Armstrong would win almost half. Has never been done before that and never done after that. That puts him in a special place. So we will be celebrating Henry Armstrong. I have him ranked number 4, greatest fighter in boxing history. End of conversation. Now, when you move up to the light heavyweight division, you will be introduced to John Henry Lewis, one of the greatest fighters of all times. John Henry Lewis would become light heavyweight champion in 1935, and he would defeat Bob Olin. He would carry that championship belt to 1938, the year that we're celebrating. And what's amazing about that is he was the second light heavyweight champion of African-American descent. See, battling Siki would defeat George Compartier for the light heavyweight championship belt, and he would lose it to Mike McTeague in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. But John Henry Lewis, who was a kin of Tom Molyneux, 1810, Tom Molyneux tried to win a championship himself when he would challenge Tom Cribb. That fight would end in 33 rounds. If we take a look at Tom Molyneux, Scrapbook Boxing, I go through the details of that fight. John Henry Lewis would also have another kin, one of the greatest rappers in boxing history. He's an outstanding hip-hop artist. His name was LL Cool J. John Henry Lewis would have multiple fights in multiple months. We'll talk about John Henry Lewis as well. One more fighter in 1938 we're going to talk about. Joe Louis. They called him Joseph Louis Barrow. Became the second African-American fighter in the heavyweight division to win a world championship. See, in 1908, Jack Johnson would defeat Tommy Burns after chasing him around the world, become the first African-American heavyweight champion. Joe Louis would be number 2. And he would win his championship belt in 1937, Comiskey Park, by knocking out Jim Braddock in 8 rounds. And he would bring prestige back into the African-American community with his grace, presence, and the way he went around his work. Let's talk about Joe Louis. He was born May 13th, 1914 in Alabama. He would move to Detroit, where he would run a locker in Brewster Center. He would meet up in Chicago with Jack Blackburn and be managed by Julian Black and John Roxborough. He'd also be trained by Harry Wiley Sr. and Manny Seaman. He was born May 13th, 1914, but he died April 12th, 1981, Las Vegas, Nevada. I never had the opportunity to meet Joe Louis. One of the greatest heavyweight championships in boxing history happened June 22nd, 1938. Joe Louis and Max Schmeling II. It became a political event. Joe Louis stood 6 foot 1 inch, and he had a 76-inch reach. Had a fighting record of 66 wins, 69 total bouts, 52 knockouts, and 3 losses. The losses were to Edson Charles, Rocky Marciano, and Max Schmeling in 1936. He would face 9 former champions. Max Baer, Primo Carnera, Max Schmeling, twice. James Braddock, Edson Charles, Rocky Marciano, Jersey Joe Walcott, twice. Billy Conn, and Jack Sharkey. Joe Louis had 5 very impressive performances in 1937, including becoming the second African-American heavyweight champion of the world. Now, January 11th, 1937, he would face a young Stanley Ketchel. January 29th, 1937, he would face Bob Pastor from the Bronx, New York. Pastor had a fighting record of 21-1-2 coming into that fight. February 17th, 1937, he'd be in the ring with Nady Brown from Kansas City. And keep in mind, he would knock all these men out. June 22nd, 1937, Jim Braddock. Jim Braddock had a fighting career record of 51-25-7 coming into that fight. Comiskey Park, Chicago, Illinois, for the NBA New York SAC Heavyweight Championship belt. 8 rounds. And Jim Braddock would be knocked out. The referee was Tommy Thomas. His first title defense was August 30th, 1937. He was a Welshman by the name of Tommy Farr. 15 rounds, unanimous decision. The referee was Arthur Donovan. And most people started to write Joe Louis off because he didn't get the knockout. But then he would face Max Schmeling. June 22nd, 1938. Schmeling had a fighting career record of 52-7-4 at that time. And it would be a first-round knockout New York's Yankee Stadium. Referee was Arthur Donovan. One of the greatest fights of all times. You see, Harlem, New York would go absolutely hysterical. Because what Joe Louis meant to that community, if you only knew. Everyone took a bath before that fight. They would wear their three-piece suit and the most expensive dresses they owned in their closet. Men would get their shoes shined, only to stay at home and turn on the radio. And they would turn on the radio and make sure it worked during the course of the day, because they could not miss that performance by Joe Louis. And they'd be at the edge of their seats. Men would smoke pipes and cigars. And sometimes the women with their kids would be in the back room, while the men would be surrounded around the radio after playing cards. And each punch that was thrown, each impact to either fighter, cringed the fist and the teeth of the men watching. And the women would pause in between conversations every time Don Dunphy would give his analysis. And that fight was over in one round. And the world couldn't believe it. Now, how significant that fight was. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had called Joe Louis to the front lawn of the White House, felt his muscles, and told him, "Joe, not only do you have to win, but you have to knock him out completely." The New York SAC would call Arthur Donovan into the office and told him, "You cannot stop the fight unless the man is completely out. You cannot afford any controversies, because this would cause a war." Because if you think back, 1936, Jesse Owens from America, of African-American descent, would win 4 gold medals in Germany's Berlin. Now, Adolf Hitler, who would take office in 1933, stated immediately that he wanted to take power. There was no way in the world, after Max Schmeling would knock out Joe Louis in 36, would he lose that opportunity of bringing home a World Heavyweight Championship belt. Because the Heavyweight Championship belt meant that your country was in control. That was the mindset of the leaders. So when Joe Louis took it to Max Schmeling and hit him with a punch so hard that Max Schmeling would scream, he would eventually fall. And he couldn't get back up because his L4 and L5, S1, C1 and C2 was collapsed. So his left leg had no strength in it. He would turn around and hold on to the ropes. He'd be hit with a kidney shot and go down. And the cornerman would throw in the towel. Arthur Donovan would pick it up and throw it back out the ring, but it would land on the front rope. Because he could not stop the fight unless the man was out. And Joe Louis would continue with combinations. And the referee would stop the fight because the cornerman would jump into the ring and carry Max Schmeling back to his corner. And that was the most happiest moment in the African-American community. And the next day at the RKO movie theater, it would be 2 lines around the block. Once again, men and women with their best clothing on would wait in line to see the fight the next day. Joe Louis was that special. And that fight in 1938, June 22nd, was perhaps one of the greatest fights in boxing history. Salute to Joe Louis, one of the greatest fighters of all times. Henry Armstrong, name was Henry Jackson Jr. He was born December 12, 1912 in Columbus, Mississippi. Now, Henry Armstrong had a father, Henry Jackson Sr. Henry Jackson was 11 of 15 children. And his father was of mixed race, part Irish, and 75% black. His mother was full-blooded Iroquois Indian, because his grandmother and grandfather on his mother's side was full-blooded Iroquois Indian, as Joe Louis's grandfather on his mother's side was full-blooded Cherokee Indian. But Henry Armstrong was 4 years old when his family moved to St. Louis because his mother would die at a young age. And they had to search for work and a better life. So in Mississippi, Henry's father was a sharecropper and lost money because of the drought. Henry's grandfather was a factor in his life, but his grandmother, Henrietta Chapman, began raising him when his mother died, and began ducking and bobbing and weaving whenever his grandmother would swing a belt or a switch when he got himself into some trouble. And his father noticed that Henry, whenever he had a street fight, was very aggressive and rushing and wrestling with the boys in the neighborhood. Henry was a bright student, and he graduated with honors in Fashion High School, 1929, and become an editor in the school newspaper and a part-time pin boy in a local bowling alley. Henry was a brilliant writer. He had plans on going to college, but his dad became ill, as Joe Louis's dad became ill. And in the case of Henry Armstrong, along with the depression, caused him to have to go and find work, various jobs such as washing dishes and working on a railroad for several hours at a time, several hours. And it was there he would discover that a young man by the name of Kid Chocolate would earn $75,000 when a newspaper hit him on the right leg. And it was at that point when he stated to himself that prize fighting would be his next move. Now, still Henry Jackson, he would meet up with a former boxer by the name of Harry Armstrong. Turns out that Harry Armstrong was a half-brother of his. And he would eventually become his manager and mentor. They met each other while working at the Colored Youth for Men in Christian Association Church. Harry suggested that Henry change his name to Melly Jackson as they began an amateur program, 1929. At the St. Louis Coliseum, 1931, Harry and Henry would hobo their trains towards Los Angeles, but they would stop in 1932. And they would visit Harry Wiley Sr. because they tried out for the 1932 Olympic Games. And Harry Wiley Sr. would help train Henry Armstrong for several months. And he enhanced his bob and weave style, showed him foot movement, showed him how to watch the knees and foot of his opponent, showed him how to steer his head in a direction where he wanted his opponent to go. Armstrong, of course, picked up a lot of tricks on his own. But Harry Wiley Sr. was a great influence in his life. So after not making the team, he would get back on various trains and travel to Los Angeles. And he would meet with a man by the name of Tom Cox. Would be at a local gym. Tom Cox would have to change his record to 100 wins, no losses, and 50 knockouts. And he would sell his contract to Work Loss, 1932, for $250. Henry Armstrong had 16 world championship fights as a professional. 1939, he was 12-1-11. And what's amazing, in 1939, in the month of October that same year, he would have 5 title defenses. In the month of October alone. Amazing. 12 title fights, 1939. He lost one, lost his lightweight championship belt back to Lou Ambers. And he would knock out 11 of his opponents. 1938, 14 wins, no losses, with 10 knockouts. Between 1936 and 1940, he would win 59, lose one draw, with 51 astonishing knockouts. He'd be inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. He would have 22 wins, 3 losses, and 17 knockouts in world title fights. 22 wins, 7 losses, and 12 knockouts on the former, current, and future world champions. He would defeat Mike Belois 3 times, Midget Wargas, Juan Zarita twice, Baby Arizmendi 3 times out of 5. Matter of fact, with Baby Arizmendi, he would win a Mexican and California State featherweight championship belt. That's not talked about. He would add those belts to his collection. Frankie Click, Chalky Wright, Benny Bass, Sammy Aingot, Lou Roddick, Sefrino Garcia, Fizzy Zivic, Lou Ambers and Lou Jenkins and Petey Cerrone, Baby Arizmendi twice, Bojack, Ray Robinson, Fitzy Zivic. These are just a handful of champions that he would face. But when you have a conversation about Henry Armstrong, he cannot be denied as being one of the greatest fighters of all times. And he would do most of his work in 1937. Like I said, one of the greatest fighters in boxing history was Henry Armstrong. Now, just to tell you a little bit about some of the titles that he won. Petey Cerrone, 1937, would lose his championship belt to Henry Armstrong. Petey Cerrone had a fighting record of 138 total bouts, 103 wins, 22 knockouts. He was born November 21st, 1906, Birmingham, Alabama. He died July 3rd, 1994. He was 87 years of age at the time of his death. Stood 5 foot 3 inches and he had a 63-inch reach. July 17th, 1939, he would retire and losing to Sammy Aingot. Sammy Aingot became lightweight champion with the NBA strap. Sammy Aingot would also face Davey Abad. He would defeat Freddie Miller for the featherweight championship belt. He would face California Joe Gans and Benny Bass and Tommy Paul and Johnny Farr. Unbelievable. Barney Ross. Armstrong would take the title from him. He had total bouts of 79 fights. 72 wins, 22 knockouts, 4 losses, and 3 draws. Died January 18th, 1967. He was 57 years of age at the time of his death, and he was residing in Chicago, Illinois. He stood 5 foot 7 inches, and he had a 67-inch reach. Fought from 1929 to 1938. He would face Sefrino Garcia 3 times, Izzy Genazzo, Jimmy McLaurin 3 times, Tony Canzoneri twice, Billy Patrol, one of the hardest punching fighters in the body of all time, Sammy Fuller, Tommy Glockin, Johnny Farr, just to name a few. Lou Ambers, the Hickmire Hurricane, fought from 1932 to 1941. He had total bouts of 104 fights, 89 wins, 28 knockouts, 8 losses, and he was stopped 8 times. He was born November 8, 1913, Hickmire, New York. Died April 25th, 1995. He was 81 years of age at the time of his death. He resided in Hickmire, New York. Now I met Petey Cerrone, Barney Ross, and Lou Ambers. And Lou Ambers stood 5'4.5" and he had a 70-inch reach. He was managed by Al Wow, trained by Whitey Bimstein, Al Savani, and Charlie Goldman. He fought fighters such as Lou Jenkins, who he lost his lightweight championship belt to, Al Bummy Davis and Paul Jr., Pedro Martinez, Davey Day, Tony Canzaneri, Jimmy McLarnin, Baby Arizmendi, Frizzy Zivit, Baling Balino, just to name a few of these fighters. Remarkable career was Lou Ambers. So you see, Henry Armstrong was the goods. I'm ranked number 4, greatest fighter in boxing history. And he did all his work, 1938. Can't ask for a better career than Henry Armstrong. Salute to these great fighters. Joe Louis, John Henry Lewis, Henry Armstrong. But I want to look at a few more fighters because 1938 was just as good to them as it was for us. Sugar Ray Robinson was recognized as the Fighter of the Year 1942 and 1951. Ring Magazine, Fighter of the Year 1950. Writers Association. Now what's amazing about Sugar Ray Robinson, 1938, just under 17 years old. But he borrowed the name from a friend by the name of Ray Robinson. His name was Walker Smith. So his license said 18. But in 1938, he would win the New York Metropolitan AAU Open Class Championship in the bantamweight division. He would defeat Ed Capelli. $1938 was some year. As I said, one of the greatest years for the black fighter. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Charlie Dwayne Burley, born September 6, 1917. He boxed from 1936 to 1950. Died October 16, 1992, 75 years of age at the time of his death. And he stood 5'9" and had a 75-inch reach. I had the pleasure of meeting Charlie Burley, as I did Ray Robinson and Henry Armstrong. What a humanitarian he was. Had a fighting career record of total bouts, 98 bouts, 83 wins, 50 knockouts, 12 losses, and he was involved with 2 draws. Very controversial. 1938, Charlie Burley had 11 bouts after having a staggering 10 bouts in 1937. You see, Thursday, January 27th, 1938, he would face Tiger Jackson. Jackson had a fighting career record of 7-1. And he knocked him out in astonishing fashion. Second round. February 3rd, 1938, Johnny Folio, 7-5-3. February 10th, 1938, Carl Turner, 29-25-10. March 3rd, 1938, Art Tate, second round knockout. Monday, March 21st, 1938, Fritzy Zivit, 57-18-4. August 2nd, 1938, Leo Zarita, 37-7. But the special moment came Monday, August 1938, August 22nd. He would face Coco Kid. Coco Kid had a fighting record of 128-5. And he would win the colored welterweight champion, 15 rounds in 1938. Charlie Wheeler would become the welterweight colored champion. Phenomenal accomplishment. So thanks for hanging in there with me. This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. 1938, one of the greatest years for the African American fighters. Salute to my subscribers. Salute to these outstanding fighters. Next video is going to be 1951. Because 1940 and 1951 have a lot in common. And we'll take a look at that right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series.